Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Barzun. Richard, thank you. Thank you, Professor Phelps. Also, can I just get everyone to give a big round of applause for Catherine and for Lizzie and for Jennifer and all the amazing work they do. So it is a joy for my brother and me to be here with all of you, and a great honor to speak about our grandfather Barzun, or as we in the family referred to him, Grandfather Barzun. He was quite formal for those of you who knew him. And Barzun, I think you'll all agree, is a fairly unusual surname, right? So as we've gone through our lives thus far, you find people who recognize the name, any relation to Jacques Barzun, and they fall into three camps. The first camp are the baseball fans. They've seen at Cooperstown that famous quotation on the wall, if you want to know the heart, whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball, the rules and reality of the game. That quotation was actually on a Trivial Pursuit card, which for my brother and me growing up in the 1980s was the cultural equivalent of being knighted. So for that group, he is the happy fan of the national pastime. Then there is a second group, the cultural conservatives. They remember him here on campus in the late 1960s. While others were sitting in, he was standing up and speaking out about political correctness and the excesses of it. And he did that through the 80s and the 90s. And for this group, he is a fellow cultural warrior, and who was fittingly, I think, in their minds, given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Republican President George W. Bush. Finally, there is the historians, and they come up to you and they say, oh yeah, he's that guy who lived a really, really long time and wrote a really long book. It's called From Dawn to, and then we help him out. Decadence. And then they usually say, I read it, and then they correct themselves, and they're like, I own it. I started it. And it's like, it's okay. You kind of know the ending. It's in the title, right? Now, all three of those caricatures have an element of truth to them, but my brother and I think that they leave a crucial element out, and it's not the portrait we want to leave this wonderful group with. And the baseball thing is actually a helpful jumping off point. When I served as US ambassador to the United Kingdom, the highlight of my time there was I would go out to 200 different high schools, and I would do a session with about as many people as there are here today, and I would ask all these 18-year-old British kids to write down one word about what frustrated them or concerned them about America, and then flip over the card and write one word that gives them inspiration or hope about America. So I did that with 20,000 British 18-year-olds, and I've been home now for 8 months, and I wanted to keep it going. So I've been doing it here in America, not at that scale yet. And here's what I've learned. The number one frustration and concern with their own country is division. Racial division, economic division, political division. The number one hope and inspiration is diversity. So if you think about the root words are the same, right? What they fear most and love best is rooted in separateness and difference. And what I've been struggling with is how might we reconcile those two things? How might we bridge that divide? Now we could turn, and we've heard this morning some amazing minds, think about what we could learn from 500 years ago today and what was nailed to the wall of a church. I want to turn to inspiration for something significantly more recent and more, I don't know how to put this diplomatically, earthy, to a men's bathroom on Interstate 95 somewhere between New York and Boston. In that men's room, right next to the mirror, someone scrawled, "Yankees suck." I'm from Boston, I agree. Then someone came out and erased what that wrote, and they wrote "Red Sox suck." And someone erased that and wrote "Yankees suck" and "Red Sox sucks." And it took about like 14 inches on the wall of this back and forth. And then along comes this guy, I assume it was a guy, it was a men's room, circled the whole debate with a green Sharpie and wrote and we all love baseball. And I thought, as a recovering diplomat, I thought, oh, how sweet. But upon further contemplation, it occurred to me, I don't think Mr. Green-Sharpe really settled the dispute. I have not been back. I suspect the debate continues, and there may be some additional commentary, including where Mr. Green-Sharpe might put that pen. I think that highlights the three things we're talking about today. You've got, in that men's room stall, you've got the tribe and the thrill of joining a group and the thrill you get from competing against the other, but also the venom it produces. Then you've got the game itself, the set of shared practices and recognized rules and the norms necessary to even have that competition. So in other words, the game of baseball itself. And then third and finally, you have the individual, the people, the person who takes the time and the energy to scrawl on the wall. Whether it's a restroom, whether it's the wall of a cave, or the door of a church. And my grandfather had something to say about all three elements, and for that, I'd like to turn it over to my brother Charles.
Well, thank you, Matthew. And let me just echo what my brother just said. Our grandfather meant a great deal to both my brother and me, and I know that Columbia meant a great deal to him. So it's really an honor to be here. And this morning's sessions were fascinating, and I look forward to the afternoon ones. To pick up where my brother just left off, asking what my grandfather might have thought about each of these three elements of the situation just described, the tribe, the background rules of the game, and the individual, will, I think, indicate what he may have thought about the theme of the conference today. It will also show why the portraits Matthew suggested as a conservative and a cultural declinist leave something important out, at least in our view. So let's begin with the tribe. Jacques Barzun's first book was based on his dissertation he wrote here at Columbia, and it was called Race, A Study in Modern Superstition. It was a critique of race thinking or nationalism, a big issue, not surprisingly, in 1932, and its essential point was that race was an abstraction and a harmful one. It was a superstition in the literal sense of the word, in that it stands over crucial facts and ignores human diversity. We learn to identify with particular groups. Doing so is not built into our biological nature. In other words, race was a social construct, though of course he did not use that term. Rather, he used the word culture. For him, culture referred to that set of background understandings and attitudes and practices within which human beings create, compete, contemplate, and live. It is what makes possible not only the rules of baseball, but also museums, markets, monasteries, and closer to my own area of study, the law. Our grandfather spent his career studying the history of culture precisely because he saw its power to guide and shape human aspirations and ambitions. Which is why seeing him as a cultural warrior, a conservative one, is slightly misleading. In the culture wars of the 1980s and still up today, conservatives tend to decry postmodernism and the rejection of traditional standards in art, politics, and morals. And they tend to defend Western values as objective and timeless, often, though not always, on religious grounds. That was not our grandfather's view at all. An admirer of William James, he rejected all metaphysical absolutes, and he resisted drawing traditional philosophical distinctions between thought and feeling, fact and value, theory and practice, world and mind. Far from attacking relativism, Barzun defended it on the ground that, properly understood, relativism told us that everything is connected to everything else. The connections between our objects of experience provide a sufficient ground for our beliefs and the only ground possible. For most of his career, his target was not postmodernism or leftist radicalism, it was materialism and scientism, the view that the world consists only in that which can be observed and measured, and that science provides the only valid method of genuine knowledge. In its place, he embraced a view that he variously called pragmatism, humanism, or romanticism. Whatever its label, it is an approach that privileges the concrete over the abstract, intuitive judgment and over analysis. And it yields knowledge associated with craft, a knowing how rather than a knowing that. So what does all this tell us about what he might have thought of the individual? Two things, I think, though I think they may stand in some tension with each other. First, the point would be that, like the concept of race, the individual is itself, as an object of moral veneration and even legal protection, a product of culture and history, a construction of it. That seems to me implicit in the title of this conference, talking about the age of the individual, itself a reference to history. But respect and concern for the individual is not just a product of culture, it is a moral achievement, though of course not one without costs and complexities, as has been discussed this morning. And precisely because the individual is a kind of achievement, the culture that produces it requires cultivation, preservation, and attention. Many of us today, I think, have acutely felt the need for culture in this way over the last year or so. Never have we heard so much from liberals and progressives about the value of norms, conventions, institutions, and settled practices. Persuading others that social change constitutes progress turns out to be quite difficult, without nodding to the background of shared moral understandings and political practices. You can't advocate for gay marriage without implicitly, at least, recognizing the value of marriage itself. And you can't fight for your team, your group, and your party without accepting in some way the rules of the game within which democratic and constitutional politics play out. The second point about the individual cuts in another direction. To see history as even capable of genuine progress and reaction, and culture as something capable of development and decadence, achievements and failures, as our grandfather clearly did, requires its own sort of faith. It is a faith in the individual capacity to reflect and to act on the basis of her reflections. For no matter how socially constructed our concepts and categories may be, at the end of the day, we experience the world from inside our own skins. Whatever culture, religion, narrative, or system of belief into which we are born is itself the product of individual human minds working to make sense of the world. And here is where the other caricature of our grandfather, Barzun as the pessimist declinist, I think falls short in some way. But here I'll turn it back over to my brother.
Thank you, Charles. So as Charles and I got ready to present here today, I went back and I found this quotation from my grandfather about how one should honor someone, an artist in this case, that you really looked up to. And he said, quote, "My notion about any artist is that we honor him best by reading him, by playing his music, by seeing his plays, or by looking at his pictures. We don't need to fall all over ourselves with adjectives and epithets. Let's play him more." So I hope my brother and I have not done too many adjectives and epithets in trying to honor our grandfather. And in closing, and to build on what Charles just said, in one of our last annual pilgrimages to San Antonio to visit with our grandfather, he handed us a cassette tape, not knowing that no one really listens to cassette tapes anymore, but he had one, and it was a recording of a talk he gave that wasn't published back in 1969, another time of unrest and upheaval. And it was called Present Day Thoughts on the Quality of Life. And after sort of going through a laundry list of what they were struggling with back then, he says the following to conclude. "Such are some of the conditions that appear to make, or are said to make, the quality of life evanescent. They are enough to suggest the likelihood that we are in a period of well-nigh total disillusion, and that before the well springs of a tolerable existence are tapped afresh, we shall go through even drearier times and more anguished moments. What the future will be is not the business of an historian to say, but whether the future lies with or without industry, with or without democracy, with or without science and technology, it is at least conceivable that the future will be without them, either through catastrophe or willful rejection. No matter, what is certain is that the desire not for life alone, not for brutish life, but for a special quality in life will not cease, even for the last shivering inhabitant of a devastated planet. That desire is planted deep, and it seeks its fulfillment, which is what makes humanity other than animal." Thank you.